What's the first thought that comes to your head when you think of iconic New York City crime? For some people, it's the Son of Sam. For some, it's things like the assassination of John Lennon or some of the cults that have come out of the city. But prior to moving to New York, when I thought New York City crime, I thought mafia. There's this beautiful, romantic, criminal, dark, awe-inspiring, and very imaginative aspect to the mafia. They inspired iconic films like The Godfather, Goodfellas, and The Untouchables. 5 families became household names. They were part of this sprawling, web-like crime network that had never been seen before, and they had an absolute chokehold on New York City. Starting in 1931, after the Castellammarese War, the 5 families dominated organized crime in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And until 1970, when the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations, or the RICO Act, was enacted, nobody could touch them. Even with RICO, the 1970s and 80s were still dominated by the mob that most of us recognize. Today, we're on the road to iconic New York, and we'll discuss how the Italian mob established itself in the United States, the 5 families and their rise and their fall from power. Today, I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse and take you to New York with me. Hello and welcome to the 3rd episode of Highway to Hell. Today we're going to go to New York City, talk about La Cosa Nostra. And if you don't know me well or follow me, I lived in New York for almost 10 years. New York City is home for me. It's where I rebuilt my life. It's where I became the person that I wanted to be. And it's the most amazing city in the world. And if you're watching on YouTube, yes, I really tried to lean into mob wife today. We did like mob wife makeup. I let my hair just be what it needs to be because I didn't have time. Before I really dive into this episode, I have a special announcement. I'm going to be living on the road for the next month, the month of April, and a lot of it is for podcast research. There's some places that I really want to do early in the podcast that I haven't been to yet. So I'm headed to Savannah and Charleston. I'm hoping to hit Denver, which I've been to, and Seattle. But I'm actually like vacating my apartment. Someone's staying here. And I'll be living in my car and couch surfing. So if you know anyone in those cities, please send me an email or a note on Instagram. My Instagram handle is Monte Mader, MonteMader. And please let me know. I would love to meet with some locals about travel recommendations or stories, especially in places like Savannah that have a lot of haunted history. So again, that's just a quick little announcement. Monty's on the road. Please follow me on all my socials. It's Monte Mader, MonteMader, everywhere. That's YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. You'll see the trip, you'll see the journey. And if you do know someone in those cities, it would be super helpful for me to have some connections there. So please do. I'm very excited to have some new cities, a little bit more paranormal, spooky stuff. But let's jump into the episode. Oh my God, I had so much fun researching this episode. So much about the mob I didn't know. The history is so beautiful. On today's Highway Highlights, we're going to talk about where the mob originated, how the American Mafia, which is the La Cosa Nostra, became the structure that we know and recognize, a brief history of their rise to power, and then we're going to focus on how the FBI was finally able to use the RICO Act to take them down. So get a drink. I have a cocktail because last week that really helped. Just felt calmer. Let's hit the road and let's explore my favorite city in the world. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, waves of Italians flocked to U.S. shores in search of better opportunities. New York City alone saw a spike in its Italian population, jump from 20,000 to 250,000 between 1880 and 1890. By 1910, that number was 500,000. And the majority of these migrants were farmers, craftsmen, unskilled laborers, fleeing brutal poverty that was plaguing rural Italy and Sicily. Most of these migrants were normal, law-abiding citizens that just wanted a piece of the American dream. But some were criminals, often exploiting members of their own communities, and Italian gangs quickly began to form to establish power. And trickling into the cities of New York and New Orleans were members of a group whose name was a twisted version of an Arabic word meaning refuge. It eventually became slang for acting as a protector against the arrogance of the powerful. Mafia. But where did this all start? Let's explore the history of the original mafia, its origination in New York, and how La Cosa Nostra became the crime syndicate that took control of New York in today's Highway Highlights. The mafia originated on the island of Sicily, which for generations was ruled by long lines of foreign invaders. Sicilians had begun to form small militias to protect themselves and their interests. They called them clans or families in order to defend themselves from foreign invaders. This was all done in complete secret. By the 19th century, the mafia took advantage of the volatile environment and extorted money from landlords. You pay us, we protect you. The Sicilian Mafia emerged from this network of criminal clans and families. In 1861, Sicily became a province of the now united Italy, which had become one country under Giuseppe Garibaldi. As the Italian government tried to establish itself, the Mafia was asked by Roman officials in the 1870s to help come in and control crime and chaos. Think of them like a private contract police force. In exchange for their help going after dangerous criminals, officials would continue to look the other way as the Mafia extorted landowners. While Rome intended just to use them until stability could be established, the Mafia entrenched themselves in Sicilian politics and the economy. They coerced people to vote for candidates beholden to the mob, and the mafiosi even worked for the Catholic Church to monitor the church's property holdings. A strong bond between mob families and the Catholic Church still exists. To strengthen their power and their secrecy, the clans began initiation ceremonies in which new members pledged secret oaths of absolute loyalty. There were rules, codes of conduct. The most important was omerta, the code of absolute silence about anything that happened in the family, and that you would never, ever help the police. The Mafia's control of Sicily grew until Prime Minister Benito Mussolini began a brutal crackdown on the mobsters that he thought was a threat to his fascist regime. I'm going to have to say this so many times, but Sicilian is such a tongue twister word for me, so if I trip and stumble over Italian and Sicilian words and names, it's tricky for me. Anyways, between 1890 and 1920, when the U.S., and in particular New York City, was experiencing an explosion of Italian immigration, much of the migrants were from poor families in southern Italy. They brought with them their culture, their traditions, and the tradition of an underground form of government. The precursor to what became the American La Cosa Nostra was the Black Hand. It was a loosely knit group of criminals who stayed within Italian communities. For Italian migrants who didn't trust the new government, problems were solved by seeking out the help of the Black Hand. But the Black Hand, like its Sicilian members, extorted money for their protection and services of those they helped, and they began to run burglary, gambling, and extortion rings. One of the most notorious Black Handers was a man named Ignazio Saeta and was known in Little Italy as Lupo, or the Wolf. Ignazio's control in the Black Hand began with extortion, and he soon married into the Morello Terranova faction, a Sicilian mafia group in the early 1920s. He merged his Black Handers with this faction to create the Morello crime family. Lupo demanded absolute obedience from his faction and is suspected of killing at least 60 people, including a family member he suspected of being a traitor. He was not arrested for any of these crimes until 1910, when he finally faced charges of counterfeiting and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The Black Hand may very well have stayed a small crime faction in only Italian neighborhoods if Congress hadn't opened the door for the American Mafia to bloom. On January 19, 1919, Congress ratified the 18th Amendment banning the manufacture, transport, and sale of alcohol in America. Prohibition really, in many ways, was the birth of the American Mafia. The burgeoning Italian-American gangs quickly went into the business of bootlegging, profiting millions of dollars in the 1920s, and soon added extortion, racketeering, loan sharking, prostitution, and murder. The American La Cosa Nostra, which means our thing, were clear that they felt that they were a separate entity from the Sicilian Mafia, but many mafiosi fleeing Mussolini came to U.S. and integrated themselves into the Americanized crime network, and the La Cosa Nostra borrowed many elements of the Sicilian mob, including the way the families were organized, initiation practices, and the Oath of Omerta. In the 1920s, the U.S. Mafia was controlled by Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria, whose faction included Charles Lucky Luciano, Alberto Mad Hatter Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Willie Moretti, Joe Adonis, and Frank Costello. Now, the reason I'm including a lot of these names, you're like, oh my God, I'm never going to remember that. These names are going to pop up over and over and over. So try to remember these. These are very key players in the Mafia coming to be what we know it. However, a powerful Sicilian named Don Vito Ferro decided to make a bid for the control of U.S. operations and sent Salvatore Maranzano from his base in Castellammare to seize control. That word, I nailed it. Oh, I've been practicing. The Castellammarese faction included Joseph Joe Bananas Bonanno, Stefano the Undertaker Magadino, and Joe Aiello. By the way, the gang and mob nicknames are the best part of this research. There's going to be some ones that are just phenomenal. Tensions began to rise as early as 1928. The violent explosion that would soon arise between the factions became known as the Castellammarese War. Masseria was known for his violence, sloppy dress, heavy drinking. He was nearly illiterate. Meanwhile, Maranzano was cultured and educated, and he studied for the priesthood in the Roman Catholic Church before turning to Sicilian crime. They could not have been more different in personality and presentation, but they were both ruthless and cold-blooded killers. Millions of dollars were at stake in the bootlegging business, but open war didn't break out until 1928 after the murder of Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein was a racketeer and kingpin in the Jewish mob with a wealth of $162 million in today's money. He is one of the wealthiest crime bosses in U.S. history. When he was murdered, his business opened up. Within a year, over 60 soldiers had been murdered in an effort to control New York's bootlegging racket. While the clash to the outside world seemed to be between Masseria and Maranzano, the face of the war, there was another war that was brewing underneath the surface. There was a generational conflict between old, traditional Sicilian leadership and the young Italian-American mafiosos known as the Young Turks. The younger Italian-Americans were forward-thinking about modernizing the mob, and unlike the Sicilians, they were willing to work with non-Italians. Man, you guys can't see this on your end, but I'm having to stop so many times and get untongue-tied. These names are so tough, but I'm doing my best. With Maranzano dead, Luciano was able to lead the Young Turks to dominance in New York City. It was Luciano, who was now the head of what would become the Genovese family, vision to structure the mafia as a major corporation. Each major city would be run by a mafia family. He believed that by doing this, he could increase cooperation and reduce conflict. Because of New York's size and profitability, Luciano decided to keep the 5 families in place, but instead of making himself boss of all bosses, which he knew would ensure attempts on his life, he created what was called the Commission. It was a ruling body of the entire American La Cosa Nostra that would be made up of the 5 heads of the families, the bosses of Chicago, and at various times the heads of the families from Buffalo, Philadelphia, and Detroit. Because of Luciano's role in the Castellammarese War and the founding of the modern structure of the American mob, he is usually referred to as the father of organized crime, and he became the most powerful mafia boss of all time. Luciano had been collaborating with the Jewish mob for a long time, and collaborated with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, who helped murder Masseria, to form what was called Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of what would now become known as the National Crime Syndicate. The 1930s began the golden era of the Mafia, who tightened their chokehold in New York City. As the country waded through the Great Depression, the Mafia became a multi-billion-dollar empire, billion with a B, in the 1930s. The repeal of Prohibition in 1933 was too late. The mob had millions of dollars in cash, new leadership, and better organization. The speakeasies they ran during Prohibition became the most fashionable nightclubs in New York. While other businesses floundered in the wake of Black Tuesday, the mob's excess cash allowed them to pay off politicians, judges, and law enforcement. The Mafia ruled New York City with an iron fist. Businesses that were already struggling to survive were now victims of protection rackets. You pay the mob to protect you and your business, or they take it out on you physically or burn down your business. The mob expanded operations to control the horse races in New York. Luciano's underboss, Frank Costello, fixed the races. Newspapers at this time glamorized the mob as an interesting and entertaining group of rebels, and powerful and influential journalists did nothing to expose their criminal activity. One particularly prominent journalist, Walter Winchell, made them local celebrities. With the news on their side and law enforcement paid for in full, the mob had no external threat. The mob was so protected that the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country, the FBI, didn't even acknowledge they exist. FBI's founder, J. Edgar Hoover, denied the very existence of the mafia, saying, "There is no mafia," to the point where he would ban the use of the word mafia in FBI correspondence. Hoover chose instead to pursue individual bank robbers like Bonnie and Clyde and John Dillinger, criminals who stole hundreds to maybe thousands from banks, while the mob raked in billions in illegal profits, and the families became larger and stronger. It was rumored that Hoover was a homosexual and also a cross-dresser, that Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello had obtained compromising photos of him, so he left them alone. This has not been corroborated, but it is very common kind of street knowledge. The mob expanded into both legitimate and illegitimate business. They controlled the top clubs and restaurants, gambling rackets, prostitution rings. They controlled every major union, including pensions, in the trucking and garment district, the construction industry, and their most important asset, they controlled all of New York's docks. Everything that went in or out of the city was controlled by the mob. Because they controlled the longshoremen's union, they had absolute control over unloading each ship that came to port. Control of the Teamsters Union allowed the mob to decide how these goods were trucked to the rest of America. They were able to skim from unions, confiscate desirable goods, and set any price they wanted. During the mob's rise to power during Prohibition and the first few years of the 1930s, New York City's mayor at the time, Jimmy Walker, who ran arguably one of the most corrupt administrations ever in New York, turned a blind eye to all of it. In 1932, Fiorello LaGuardia was elected as mayor and promised to rid the city of the mob. He said on a broadcast, "We intend to have a general house cleaning. Yes, we'll not only clean the streets of this city, but I'm going to clean every department of every grafting Tammany politician and appoint honest men and women in their place." He soon appointed attorney Thomas E. Dewey as special prosecutor to go after gangsters. Dewey soon began pursuing Dutch Schultz, a Jewish mobster who was not a made member of any family. While he was not part of the larger machine of the Italian Mafia, he was a violent and powerful gangster. Dewey's pursuit of Schultz made him so nervous that Dewey reached out to Albert Mad Hatter Anastasia, one of the founders of Murder Incorporated, who was a vicious and accomplished hitman, to take a hit out on Dewey. When Anastasia told Lucky Luciano of the plan to assassinate Dewey, Luciano, knowing that Dewey's death would bring heat and publicity to the families, decided to eliminate Schultz instead. In 1935, at the Palace Chop House in the Bronx, Schultz was killed by over 20 rounds from Luciano's hitmen. Schultz's death did not have the intended effect, though. With Schultz gone, Dewey turned his investigative eye onto Luciano himself. In 1937, Dewey was able to use trumped-up prostitution charges of running a ring and sentenced Luciano to 30 years. Charlie Lucky Luciano, the head of the Genovese family, just became prisoner 92168 at New York's Sing Sing prison. But Luciano's downfall did not slow the success of the mob. Frank Costello assumed control of the Genovese family, and their growth continued. In the 1940s, the mob moved into the boxing racket. Frankie Carbano orchestrated the mob's racket in the fighting world using his control of the Managers Guild, the promoters, and the matchmakers. Carbo controlled every aspect of New York fights and used his influence to fix fights and line the pockets of the mob. If you were a fighter who wanted to be on a board, you would not get a title shot unless you worked with Carbo. Fighter John LaMotta for years refused to work with Carbo, but even after winning 40 top fights, LaMotta was not given a shot at the middleweight title. Jake finally met with Carbo. After his meeting in the fall of 1947, LaMotta was unequally matched with a fighter named Billy Fox. This was a fight he should have won easily, but instead he stood around taking punches from Fox. It was clear he had been told to throw the fight. The mob made a fortune on the upset. However, 2 years later, in the fall of 1949, LaMotta was finally given his shot at the title that he won and held for 2 years before being beaten by Sugar Ray Robinson. There were occasional investigations into the fights, but they were just for show. The mob maintained control of boxing well into the 1960s. America's entrance into the Second World War simply provided more money for the mob. Because of rationing, certain things like tires, gas, meat, fresh fruit, and stockings were often hard to find. The mob's control of shipping and the waterfront meant that they had an endless access to hard-to-come-by items. The mob used rationing as a means to create an entirely new black market for goods. During the war, the government was powerless to stop sabotage in the harbor by foreign agents. Since the mob still controlled all the docks, the government turned to Lucky Luciano for help. Offering to turn a blind eye to the mob's dealings and to allow Luciano access to his connections, the sabotage suddenly stopped, and Luciano was promised amnesty after the war for his help. He was released from prison after the war and deported to Sicily. Now let's have a little conversation about Murder Incorporated. I've mentioned a few times that Murder Incorporated was the enforcement arm of the mafia who could be contracted by external groups as well. They were also the only people who could kill a made man, who had, for instance, worked with police or broken the oath of omerta. So what would happen is if someone decided that a made man deserved to die, whether he betrayed somebody or he was running drugs, like you were not allowed to run drugs in the mafia. So if they found out you were doing it, the commission would decide if this made man deserved to be killed or not. And if the commission decided that, then Murder Incorporated were the only people allowed to kill a made man. In the early days, these hits often fell to Mad Hatter Anastasia, who was known as Lord High Executioner. Anastasia was an underboss of the Mangano family, which would later become the Gambino family. During his period controlling Murder Incorporated, authorities think he is responsible for over 500 killings. Anastasia was an effective killer, but seen by many as a loose cannon, which is how he earned the moniker of the Mad Hatter. In 1957, his own underboss, Carlo Gambino, arranged to have Anastasia murdered while he was getting a shave at the barber. Luciano had left Frank Costello in charge of his family when he went to prison, but Vito Genovese, an associate of Luciano since before the families were established, was extremely unhappy with this decision. If you remember, when I read those names initially between those two starting Italian factions in the U.S., Vito Genovese was one of those members. And Vito Genovese was the one who conspired with Luciano to murder Masseria in order to end the war. So Genovese has been here since day one. He's known Lucky since day one. He's the reason that Lucky got his position. So he was not happy that he was not given control of the family. Since he had been with Lucky since the Castellammarese War, he felt that he should be the new godfather. Of all the ruthless leaders in New York's massive crime network, Genovese was probably the most ruthless and violent. While he intended to overthrow Costello, his plan changed when he was forced to flee to Italy in 1937 to avoid murder charges. Vito had fallen in love with a married woman, and in order to marry her himself, he had thrown her husband off a roof and then married her. Not suspicious at all. He stayed in Italy until 1944, but was eventually deported back to the States to stand trial. Shockingly, or maybe not shockingly at all, the four major witnesses to his crime all vanished before the trial, which led to the charges being dropped. His wife initiated divorce proceedings to be with her new lover that she had taken when he fled to Italy. Days after initiating divorce proceedings, her lover was found castrated in an alley with his genitals stuffed in his mouth. She stopped the divorce proceedings and stayed with Genovese, obviously. Genovese would play a pivotal role in the downfall of La Cosa Nostra. The 1950s marked the start of the beginning of the decline of the mob's empire. While it started out as a lucrative decade, events began to change for the environment in the mob. A senator began to investigate mob activities in a televised investigation focused on crime boss Frank Costello. These televised hearings in 1951 fascinated Americans who were hearing about the mob for the first time. These hearings had higher ratings that year than the World Series. For the first time, the harshness of the mafia was revealed to Americans at large. These hearings forced Hoover's hand in acknowledging the existence of the mob and forced the FBI to participate in investigating them. In 1957, an attempt was made on Frank Costello's life as he walked into his apartment building. The gunman, Vincent Gigante, was hired by Vito Genovese, who still intended to take over the family. But Vincent's bullet missed and only nicked Costello's ear. After the attempted murder, Costello stepped down as Don of the Luciano family and retired to Florida. Costello was like, you know what? I've got my money. I'm good. I'm gonna go. Vito Genovese became the leader of the Luciano family that he would rename the Genovese family. Of course he did. The issue was that this murder attempt of a Don brought down a lot of unwanted and continuous publicity on New York City's mob. This was the same year that Carlo Gambino had Albert Anastasia murdered, and so the mob was constantly in headlines and a very unwanted limelight. The murder and attempted murder of the two bosses was an unprecedented move that sent shockwaves through the mob structure. After these murder attempts, the National Commission decided to call an emergency meeting with every, and I mean every, mob boss from all the crime families across the country. They wanted to settle disputes, prevent further publicity, and put the mob back in quiet order. The meeting was set to happen in October of 1957 at the home of Joseph Barbara in Appalachian, New York. And this is, I believe, pronounced Appalachian, because down here in Nashville in the South, it's different. But Appalachian, New York. Over 80 of the most influential gangsters in the country were attending this meeting. 2 local police officers, noticing unusual traffic towards the home, decided to investigate. When the mobsters began to flee, police called for backup, and 60 of the bosses were arrested. The arrests in Appalachian did not result in any convictions, but it once again kept the mob in a very public eye. Shortly after this disaster, Vito Genovese was convicted of drug trafficking and sentenced to 15 years in prison. While incarcerated, Genovese, who was told another mob prisoner named Joseph Valachi was talking to authorities, ordered a hit on Valachi. Now, Valachi wasn't speaking to authorities, but when he found out that Genovese had ordered the hit, he decided to turn state's evidence.
And a knife on the table. And
how many were at the table?
About 35 to 40. And sat me down and made me repeat in Italian.
Did they set you down at the table or in a chair out front?
No, sat me down on the end of the table with Maranzano doing the talking, next to Maranzano.
All right. Now, you sat next to him. Then what happened?
Well, he had the knife and the gun on the table. I repeated some words he told me, but I only could explain what he meant. I could repeat the words, but they were in Sicilian.
They were what?
In Sicilian.
In Sicilian.
You
repeated, but you didn't understand what they meant.
Right. Then they explained.
They explained what they meant. Who explained? Maranzano?
Well, he could talk pretty good English, Maranzano. He talked 12 languages. He went on to explain that you lived by the gun and by the knife, and you died by the gun and by the knife.
So this was the first time that Congress and the American public knew how a family was structured. They knew how Maranzano raised money initially when he set up the 5 families. They knew how these ceremonies were going on. But also, when I was deep diving into this old, like this is original footage, I found out that he also testified. Do you remember when I talked about the Artichoke King, the guy that had the literally worst mob name in history? He talks about him and how he essentially failed as a gangster. So when Masseria was assassinated and the Artichoke King panicked and couldn't drive the car, it essentially ruined his career in crime. So listen to this next clip.
The man known as the Artichoke King, how a hoodlum came to be regarded as a failure in his chosen profession and died of a broken heart.
Somebody described to me, I don't remember who, how Ciro was so shaky in putting the key in the ignition that they threw him off the wheel. I'm talking about Ciro Tavernova. And they threw him off the wheel, and ever since then, Ciro Tavernova was getting what we call buckwheats.
Getting what?
What we call buckwheats, you know, like he was being stripped, you know, a little at a time. He was being taken off, his power was being taken away from him. And after a while, he took it so hard that he died from a broken heart. I'm talking about Ciro Tavernova.
He kind of lost face, did he, with his...
Yes. And they replaced him at that time with Mike Capola.
In other words, they felt that he didn't have enough nerve.
Well, yes, he sort of put it this way, he disgraced himself.
He disgraced himself.
Couldn't get the key.
By showing his nervousness.
Yeah, he was shaking. So I got that from the soldiers as we go along in life.
Valachi's testimony was not just a violation of the Code of Omerta, but it gave law enforcement a chance. It would take them a while, but it gave them a chance to begin to fight organized crime. Let's talk about the 70s and 80s. While it was a slow disintegration, Valachi's testimony began the slow crumbling of the crime syndicate, but especially New York's La Cosa Nostra. Throughout the remainder of the 60s, law enforcement were locking up members of the crime family on any charge they could make stick. While it was a slow disintegration, Valachi's testimony began the slow crumbling of the crime syndicate, but especially New York's La Cosa Nostra. Throughout the remainder of the 60s, law enforcement were locking up members of the crime families on any charge they could make stick. Continuing the mob missteps, in response to this, Joe Colombo, the boss of the Prohibition family that would become the Colombos, fought back by founding the Italian American Civil Rights League. The idea being, they're persecuting us, we're going to fight back as Italian Americans. The problem with this was it drew far too much media attention, and the National Commission decided to have Colombo murdered. This was the first time in mob history that the commission decided to have a boss murdered. Murdering a boss had never come up for vote. It had never been a conversation. Joey Gallo from the Gambino family hired a hitman to take out Colombo. But on June 28, 1971, Jerome Johnson, the hitman, murdered Colombo in front of thousands of people by shooting him in the head twice at an Italian-American unity rally. Johnson was immediately killed by Colombo's bodyguards, and again, the mob is in the public eye. However, even into the mid to late 1970s, New York was still in the throes of violence. It was dubbed Fear City by first responders, and there was actually an abandoned tunnel that was used by the mob to hide bodies of at least 60 murder victims. Serial killers like the son of Sam were popping up, and the city was terrified and everything was unpredictable. Even at this time, law enforcement believed that the mob's income topped $60 to $100 billion a year, and they were very much still in control of the city. The mob continued to extort money from local businesses, defrauded the government out of millions of dollars in tax on gasoline in an operation that grew 8 to 10 millions a week, and they were still in control of all the major imports and exports out of the city. The FBI and local law enforcement, they just couldn't keep up with mafia business. The organized crime investigations were being conducted by 3 separate FBI offices that not only approached the investigation differently, but they weren't communicating with each other. Thanks to Valachi's testimony, law enforcement knew how the families were structured and who most of the players were, but they had no access to the men in charge because they weren't committing the crimes. Only the low-level soldiers were. The 70s also saw the mob move into heroin and cocaine trafficking because the money was too good. And I'll say that with a caveat because it was certain mobsters, because for some of the more traditional bosses, especially the ones that were associated with Luciano, they still would not allow anyone to run drugs. And if you ran drugs, they would kill you. But there was a big shift kind of in the undertow of the mob to move into drugs because of the money that they could make at this time. A key turning point in the investigation was when law professor G. Robert Blakely, who wrote and helped pass the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, or RICO Act of 1970, specifically to target organized crime, held a training course at Cornell to teach the FBI how to use the RICO Act to take down organized crime. The law had been in effect for almost 10 years, but law enforcement, even on the federal level, had no idea how to use it. RICO allowed access to key players in organized crime because now you could convict someone who ordered someone else to commit a crime. You can prosecute an entire organization at one time. Professor Blakely's 1979 seminar changed the entire FBI investigation into the mob. So we're going to switch lanes and we're going to shift a little bit out of the mob's point of view and we're going to shift into the FBI's. This was really the major downfall of the crime families in New York City. This is where the Italian mob kind of fell out of power. So grab some popcorn. We're really going to dive into how FBI was able to do this. The FBI formed the 5 family squads. Each squad focused on all the information that pertained to their assigned family. The investigation's major issue was omerta. It was really tough to get a witness to talk. Michael Francis, a captain of the Colombo family, confirmed that the omerta ceremonies remained in effect and relatively unchanged even up to his initiation in 1975. Without witnesses, the FBI created one of the largest bugging and wiretapping investigations in FBI history. They needed to hear these men confirm their involvement in their own crimes before they could use the RICO Act to convict them. Agents assigned to the Gambino family were tasked with bugging Paul, the white-collar Don Castellano, who had constantly had several hitmen around him at all times. Although he carried this persona of being a businessman, he had called for the execution of at least 20 people. Castellano had become the Don of the Gambino family after Carlo Gambino was ordered to be deported for an attempted hijacking. Since the FBI could not place a bug in Castellano's Staten Island house without a court order, they needed more information. The Bergen Hunt and Fish Club was a known meeting place of the Gambino family. This was more for street-level rackets like loan sharking, gambling, bookies, and hijackers. Captain John Gotti, we all know who he is, was a major leader among the soldiers who met there. Agents needed to find a weak link, and they found it in Angelo Ruggiero. A violent personal bodyguard of Gotti, Ruggiero was a big gossip and was constantly talking. They were able to get a court order to bug Angelo Ruggiero. The FBI employed the black bag men, who were adept at planting listening devices and breaking into locked doors to start planting devices. By interrupting his phone service, a black bag man was able to plant a device posing as a phone company employee. By gathering information about Ruggiero's meetings in the Castellano house, the FBI had enough proof now to bug the house of the white-collar Don. After learning how to disrupt his cable service, agents were able to plant a bug in Castellano's main meeting room. Once agents learned about Castellano's affair with his maid Gloria, they were able to convince her to be an unknowing informant, and she even gave them family pictures of the Castellanos. One shocking discovery that the FBI could now prove with recordings was that the Mafia still controlled all the major labor unions, not just in NYC, but in the whole country. Pension funds provided the mob with hundreds of millions of easily accessible and movable funds. The Colombo squad began by surveilling the acting boss, Gennaro Longello. Noticing that every Friday he would go to the Casa Storta restaurant in Brooklyn, they found the meeting place for the hierarchy of the Colombo crime family. Joe Cantamessa, the same black bag man who was tasked with bugging Castellano's house, was tasked to bug the Casa Storta. One night after closing, 2 agents went to plant the bug in the back room where the family are known to sit. They were able to successfully plant this bug and now began collecting information from the top names in the Colombo crime family. Tony Dux Corallo was the boss of the Lucchese family, earning his nickname from being able to duck subpoenas and arrest attempts. Corallo was also known for being similar to Castellano in that he wasn't flashy or showy and very much adhered to La Cosa Nostra values. From informants and external wiretaps, the FBI identified Sal Avellino, a soldier in the Lucchese family, as Corallo's driver. Avellino's Jaguar had to be bugged, but agents had to prove to a judge that the 2 people in the car were critical to the RICO case and that the business was being discussed in the car. Using some Lucchese informants, the FBI was able to secure the court order. Technicians practiced planting a bug in an identical Jaguar and timing it to make sure that they could install it as quickly as possible. On a rainy night, when Avellino attended an event, minutes after he walked into the building, there was a bug behind the heater of his car. By the mid-'80s, the agents had up to 25 bugs and taps going at the same time. Fat Tony Salerno was the ultimate target of the massive Genovese crime family. He was known to frequent the Palma Boyd Social Club on 115th Street in East Harlem. He would come into the club on Monday morning, and he would leave every Thursday. It was the time that neighbors would come in with issues and ask Fat Tony for help. He was kind of a white knight in the community. Bugs in the social club immediately gave access to Lucchese dealings, and on December 12, 1984, I'm sorry, I said Lucchese, it's Genovese dealings. And on December 12, 1984, recorded a meeting between Fat Tony and Tony Corallo of the Genovese family. This was critical because it didn't just prove that the families were involved in crimes within their family, it proved collaboration with each other. Going further, in a conversation with the Don of the Buffalo family, Fat Tony said, "You tell your family this is coming from the commission." It was the first time that the FBI had a tangible lead that the elusive commission even existed. The FBI finally had concrete evidence of all their informants had been telling them about the commission. They had evidence that 5 bosses in New York City made up the commission and decide the rules for every mob family in the country and exert a huge amount of control in all these different industries. The acting Southern District Attorney, Rudy Giuliani, came up with the idea that RICO could be used to take down the commission and rip apart the mob from the very top down. It was an unprecedented case, and RICO had never been used on a case that was so massive. Law enforcement had to prove that the 5 bosses of the 5 families made up the commission, number 1. They had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt a link in a series of crimes to the commission, and if they could do that, RICO could bring down the 5 families all at one time. So the plan here, and this was really Rudy Giuliani's idea, like he really needs to be credited for this. This was his plan. The idea was, okay, we know this commission exists now. If we can 100% prove that the 5 bosses are part of the commission, and we can link a series of crimes to the commission, we can not only take out the 5 bosses, but when we take out the 5 bosses, we take down all the families. Thanks to the extensive bugging and the FBI had in place, they found their link. It turned out to be New York City construction. At this time, skyscrapers were flying up on the island of Manhattan, each job worth millions of dollars. The wiretaps soon indicated that there was some working relationship between the mob and all the major concrete companies in New York City. Through the Colombo family, the FBI identified a soldier who was present at all of the meetings with the bosses regarding construction. They identified this soldier as Ralph Scopo, the president of the District Council of the Cement and Concrete Workers Union. God, that's a mouthful. The president of the District Council of the Cement and Concrete Workers Union. There it is. Law enforcement now shifted their surveillance to Scopo, the man who controlled all the laborers at every construction project in New York. Scopo would meet with construction company presidents and remind them what would happen if they stepped out of line or, say, didn't pay the mob their percentage. The mob just might organize a strike because they controlled the union, or there might be a line of graves. Now, they needed to prove that the commission itself was at the heart of this construction extortion scheme. The FBI team surveilling the families found out a reference to what the bosses were calling the club. The club consisted of 8 construction companies that were connected to the mob. Any construction job that was over $2 million was immediately allocated to one of these 8 companies, and they were the only ones allowed to bid. They also discovered that the contractors working with Ralph Scopo would kick back 2% to the mob families to be divided up. The conversations eventually linked the commission beyond a shadow of a doubt to every major building project being built in New York. After they proved the existence of the Concrete Club, it still was not enough to win a RICO trial against the commission. The FBI had to be able to link the construction racket to the underlying crimes, preferably something a little bit more violent. FBI agents Pat Marshall and Charlotte Lang were tasked with proving that the commission had approved a murder. 6 years earlier, Carmine Galante, the acting boss of the Bonanno family, had been murdered in a gang-style execution that law enforcement was sure was linked to the mob. He was eating lunch at an Italian restaurant when 5 armed men walked in and opened fire. 2 other men at his table were killed as well. Informants had told law enforcement that the only way that a boss takes a hit is if the commission themselves approve it. So this was the second boss the commission approved. In 1984, the FBI rebuilt the case top to bottom, trying to find a way to identify the shooters and be able to tie them back to the commission. Using a palm print that was left on the getaway car, one of the shooters was identified as Bruno Indelicato, a Bonanno soldier who had been promoted to captain after Carmine's death. An unrelated surveillance tape showed Indelicato and other 2 attending a party with the Gambino party 30 minutes after the shooting. He walks into this event and he's seen and he's congratulated and hugged and everybody's shaking hands. And it was extremely compelling evidence that the other bosses of the commission had approved the hit. On the May 15th, 1984, the FBI was tipped off that a commission meeting was happening that day. This would be the first time they had the opportunity to surveil a meeting itself. Surveillance was placed outside where the family was supposed to be meeting, and after several hours, they were able to get pictures for the very first time of a meeting between all 5 bosses. This had never been proven. The 5 bosses had never been seen together. They had proved that the commission was real. Arrest warrants were granted, and on February 25th, 1985, in a landmark law enforcement move, all 5 godfathers of the Cosa Nostra were arrested. Paul Castellano and Fat Tony were both able to post bail of $2 million a few hours later. All 5 bosses were eventually able to post bail, and they waited for trial. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano was gunned down by 3 men outside of Sparks Steakhouse on 46 between 2nd and 3rd Avenue. Due to people knowing to lie in wait for him there, it was immediately believed that members of his own family helped with the hit. Like most mob bosses, Castellano forbid the trafficking of drugs, and it was a crime punishable by death. But within his own family, the Gambinos, Captain John Gotti and Angelo Ruggiero were moving a lot of drugs. When Gotti and Angelo realized that Angelo's house had been bugged, and they knew that Paul Castellano was going to find out about their drug business, they knew that he would take out a hit on them. So they decided to strike first. Castellano's death brought on fear of a gang war and increased the pressure on the trial team to win the case, because now they're facing the 5 families erupting into another gangland war similar to the Castellamarese War. Giuliani and law enforcement made sure that the press was permeated with news about the case in as much detail as they were legally allowed to give. The goal was that every potential juror in the market would be able to understand the basics of the case and the basic of what RICO as a law meant. Death threats were issued against Rudy Giuliani, who was warned by the U.S. Marshals. And then the biggest mafia trial in history started. And something interesting about this trial, so Rudy Giuliani is the Southern District's state attorney, or attorney general, I mean. So his assistant attorney generals, who are the ones that are actually prosecuting the case, were 29 and 30. So there was 2 of them that were 29 years old. One of them was 30 years old, which is crazy. Like, you're doing one of the biggest cases in history at 29 years old is just amazing to me. The bulk of the trial was built on hours of recorded tapes, and both mafia and concerned citizens followed every reported detail. The prosecutor's job was to make sure all the tapes, information, and the complex meaning of RICO digestible to 12 ordinary jurors. Because their vote had to be unanimous, so for the prosecution, they have to get a unanimous vote. All the defense has to do is convince one juror not to convict. That's all they have to do. When the evidence was presented about the Galante murder, Bruno Indelicato, a defendant named in the trial because he was a gunman in the murder, jumped to his feet and threatened one of the prosecutors in open court. Days after testimony and so much evidence, the jury is sent off to deliberate. The jury deliberated for 5 long, excruciating days. The court was so packed when they came to their conclusion that prosecutors had to be escorted to their tables to even get in. There was no standing room left. The jury foreman began to read the list of verdicts. Guilty, 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 150 times. It was the largest mafia conviction in history. After this conviction, Gotti assumed control of the Gambinos, and unlike his predecessor, Castellano, he was flamboyant and he loved publicity and he flaunted being a godfather. And despite his love for the public eye, law enforcement really struggled to get charges to stick to Gotti, which was actually pretty incredible. He was so good at avoiding conviction that he earned the nickname the Teflon Don. I love these nicknames so much. I love them. Gotti did know that his top associate and his co-conspirator, Sammy Gravano, was the only person that could convict him of the murder of Castellano. So he decided to have Gravano murdered. This caused Gravano to flee to authorities to avoid his own death and murder charges and turn state's evidence in return for Gotti. So the reason that Gotti got was because he took a hit out on one of his allies because he was worried he would turn him in. And it was the same thing that Genovese did with Valachi. He heard someone was doing state's evidence, which they weren't. He was afraid they'd turn him in, and so he killed him or tried to kill him. And it was that attempt to murder him that made them turn state's evidence. John, the Teflon Don Gotti, was sentenced to life in prison for murder, where he died of cancer. The 5 Italian families are still around today, but they're significantly less powerful now than the dominant Russian crime syndicate and their rivals, both the South American and the Chinese syndicates. And that is the history, rise, and downfall of La Cosa Nostra. I hope that you enjoyed this as much as I did. I spent so much time on this because there was so much information and there's so much that you have to separate between Hollywood and culture and and then to really narrow it down. It was really fun. It was so much fun. But again, New York being my favorite city in the world, let's talk about travel recommendations. And if you've never been to New York, I would definitely, again, I lived there for 10 years, but if you've never been, it is worth seeing the big touristy things. Go to Times Square once. Once is probably all you're going to need. But it's beautiful, and it's a pretty amazing technological feat. The Statue of Liberty is great. Do those things. If you've never been, do those things. My recommendations are going to be more focused on my personal experiences as well as, a little mob focus. Obviously, thinking of the mob, go to Little Italy. So much food and like history and just some of the best like artisanal Italian meats, cheeses, breads. It's amazing. Absolutely go to Little Italy and go to Spark Steakhouse. So Spark Steakhouse is the one that Paul Castellano was shot outside of. I've eaten there. It is like it's like stepping back in time. It is so well preserved. The food is delicious, and this is going to be more on the high end of your dining, but it's amazing. Absolutely go to Spark Steakhouse. Enjoy the history. If you're in New York, it's not enjoying New York food culture unless you get a slice of pizza. New York has the best pizza in the world, and I will fight anyone who says otherwise, because you're wrong. It's inaccurate. Go to Joe's Pizza on Carmine Street. Get a true New York slice, and you can send me an email thanking me. You're welcome. Another one of my favorite places I go every time, not every time, but I try to go every time I'm in New York, is Ivan's Ramen. This is the best ramen I've ever had in my life. In my life. And it's actually close to another place I'm going to tell you about here in a second. But if you like ramen, Ivan Ramen, it's close to East Houston Street. It is so good. It is so good. And one of my personal favorite places, so when I lived in New York, I lived in Astoria. I worked in Manhattan. Astoria's in Queens, for those of you that aren't familiar. And there was a place near my subway stop called the King of Falafel and Shawarma. And when I tell you that this is some of the best food I have ever eaten in my entire life, they have like a shawarma gyro sandwich. I think I got that sandwich for maybe like 30 days straight. Like just every day after work, I'm like, I know where I'm going. I'm getting this. So if you're in Astoria or you really like shawarma type food, you're not going to beat it. You will not, listen to me, you will not find a place that is better. You won't. Okay? So those are my food recommendations. Again, New York, there's going to be so many episodes, but there's so much good food that it would be impossible for me to tell, but we're going to start there, okay? So Spark Steakhouse, we love some mob history. Joe's Pizza, get a New York slice. Ivan Ramen, it's the best ramen in the world. And then go to the King of Falafel and Shawarma, get the chicken shawarma pita. Again, you can send me an email and thank me. I appreciate it. One of the things that I wanted to include with New York, especially in the light of the mob, because Prohibition is really what gave the mob its power. And they were the ones that ran the speakeasies because they were in control of the bootlegging industry in New York. So New York still has a ton of speakeasies. And I'm going to tell you about my favorite ones. My ultimate favorite is called the Back Room. So you're going to take the F train to Delancey Street. It's on Norfolk Street. And it has the same building, same hidden entrance that it had 85 years ago. That hasn't changed. You'll be walking down the street, and if you don't know how to find the back room, you won't find it. Because you open this gate, you go down a flight of stairs, through this underground alley, and you go to this big black door. And you knock a few times, security opens it, and when you walk in, you time travel. You time travel to the 1920s. It's dripping in these luxurious couches and red velvet, and there's pinup girls on the wall, and they still serve all of their cocktails in teacups, and they serve their beer in paper bags. That's where that originated, because you couldn't have a beer. They have this rosemary cocktail where they burn rosemary over it, and it is just, my friend Hollis, thank you Hollis, took me there for my 25th birthday, and it is my favorite. My second favorite speakeasy is called Please Don't Tell. And I'm going to tell you. I'm telling you right now. It's in St. Mark's Place between Avenue A and First Avenue. So you're going to take the L train to First Avenue. And there's a phone booth in Criff's Dogs that you're going to go through. So the phone booth is your entrance. You go in and then you'll be able to access the speakeasy from there. It's beautiful, dark, intimate space. And my third is Bathtub Gin. So Bathtub Gin is on 9th Avenue between 18th and 19th Street. You'll take the train to either the 14th Street, 8th Avenue stop or 23rd Street. And some of you are like, what the hell are you talking about? Save this episode. It'll help you navigate the train systems. Bathtub Gin is behind the wall in this coffee shop. So during the day, it's an operational coffee shop. You walk in, you can get coffee, bagel, snack, whatever. When you go in at night, you can knock on the wall. The wall opens and they let you back in. And Bathtub Gin is like dark mahogany and gold. And you walk into the center of the room and there's literally this big gold bathtub. And this speakeasy is very gin forward, obviously. So a lot of their cocktails are focused on gin. Gin was a super popular Prohibition alcohol. It's just beautiful. It's just beautiful. And I'm the kind of person, as you learned from my Nashville episode, I love speakeasies. So those are my 3 favorite. New York was the reason I fell in love with a speakeasy. So those are the ones to go see. Let's talk about things to do. Again, New York is a city that you could do a new thing every day for years, and you would never run out of things to do. It's that amazing. But these are some of my favorites, some of the things I still do when I go visit. And the first one is attend a Broadway show. It is so worth it. If you love music or theater at all, go see a show, because seeing a video of it or seeing a play is so different than seeing it on the Broadway scale. Like the level of talent of the singers and the dancers and the costuming and the size of the stages in the theaters. It is an incredible, incredible experience. And I don't really know what shows are playing right now. I know the Phantom of the Opera got stopped. It was the longest running show ever. It was a beautiful show. I saw it a couple times. But they're worth it. Read the reviews. Find a story you like. Go watch them. Do it. My favorite place in the city. And when I used to work in Rockefeller Center, I would go here every month, is the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I am having a hard time with English words today. The Metropolitan Museum of Art is breathtaking. The exhibits are wonderful. My favorite section is they have a permanent Egyptian exhibit that is, I've loved Egyptian history since I was a kid. I was super nerdy as a kid and was obsessed with King Tut and just their lore and their religion and what they were able to build. And this exhibit is exquisite. They actually have, when you go through the main part of the exhibit and you walk into the next section, they actually replicated a tomb as it would have been built. It's stunning. It is stunning. The Met, you have to go. Also the Museum of Natural History. Just incredible. Like the fossils and the animals and just like it's just so much, and it's so beautiful and so well done. It is really well worth the visit. And right now, if you're going to New York in the near future, there's a Harry Potter exhibit. So please go. It's like an exhibition. It's so great. I went twice the last time I was there because I loved it so much. But I would 10 out of 10 recommend going to the Harry Potter exhibition too, if you're going there soon. And then let's talk about, as I always do in my episodes, because I love music and I'm a musician, let's talk about places to go to see music. If you're seeing an actual concert, so if you're seeing a band and you don't want to go to a big arena show in the Garden, look at places like Radio City Music Hall, Beacon Theater, Webster Hall, Carnegie Hall if you like classical music. Those venues are so much more intimate and they're really beautiful. The architecture is beautiful. There's so much thought placed into how they appear. Just absolutely gorgeous. If you're looking for original music, you have to go to the Bitter End. The Bitter End is probably one of the most iconic original venues in the city. Stevie Wonder played there, Bob Dylan, Lady Gaga, Jackson Browne, Neil Diamond, Gavin DeGraw. I've actually played there. Like, it's one of my prouder moments as a singer. I played there with my band, The Big Sky, and it's really fun. Just check their calendar. They've always got original music coming in, and sometimes they have surprise guests. Like, I was there once for an original show. It was like a songwriters event, and Hall & Oates came in and just played a set. And it's like, I'm talking, this is like a 50-person venue. And and they just came in and played a set. Another favorite music venue of mine is the Blue Note Jazz Club. And I know that Blue Note is technically a chain. I've actually been to the one in Honolulu as well. But the Blue Note in New York is it's so intimate and it's so beautiful. They always have these outstanding acts that come through. Incredible Christmas shows that come in. And it is just, when in New York, because New York is a beautiful, wonderful city, and it's also a really tough place. Like, there is a reason that people say, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. Because New York is brutal. It's brutal. So for me, because I was working full time and I was working these long hours, when I wanted to take myself out, I would get dressed up and go to Blue Note. The food was exquisite. The music was great. It's intimate. So if you're like me and you love like a good dinner jazz vibe, Blue Note's the place to go. And my other favorite, I love Mercury Lounge. It's much more an indie rock venue. Great acts come through. A lot of up-and-comers come through Mercury Lounge. So for those of you that are listening from Nashville, it's Mercury, not Mercy, because I know that'll confuse some people when I've talked about it. It's a really fun venue. If you like the indie rock or the indie punk scene, Mercury Lounge is the place to go. And I hope that you have had as much fun on this mob journey as I have. It was really such a fun learning experience for me. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, please, please, please like, follow, subscribe to the episode. That helps me so much. And reviews are totally free for you, and they're so helpful. It really helps me promote the podcast, look for sponsors, things like that. And in the very near future, I'm hoping to have someone filming this for me, as well as being in a formal studio. I've been making some connections there. And I'm just very excited and very thankful. Thank you for jumping on the highway with me. Thank you for coming down the road with me. And I will see you next time.